Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. In this week's tutorial I'm going to try and answer one of the questions I often get asked and frequently get asked about adding allowances to your pattern in order to create your trank and then sort of get a pattern that will fit your hand and at the same time kind of make the fingers look nice and balanced. So this tutorial just explains how I add my allowances to help sort of balance out the pattern. One of the things that we need to remember, and it's probably one of the key things that we need to remember, is that the leather in our pattern, particularly in our trank, is going to be wrapping around our hand, so we have to factor that in when we are working out our allowances and our templates. So one of the first things I like people to do when they're creating their gloving patterns in class is to measure around their hands. So we measure around the hand with it open and with it closed, and this we're going to be basically noting those differences because it's our closed fist measurement that's going to be helping us guide the width of the glove. So you want to measure around the sort of the widest part of your hand. I usually find wrapping a tape measure around an extra kind of loop helps to give me some stability, and you might just want to sort of move it up and down to the sort of the fleshier parts of the hands and then note the measurements. So do this for both hands, open and closed, and then we normally make the pattern for the larger hand, but of course you can make a pattern for the other hand as well if you wish. So we're going to measure the open hand and then we're going to close the fist, and again you might wish to sort of move the tape measure around a little bit to see which part is the widest, and you don't want to be sort of pulling the tape measure really tight. You want it to sit comfortably around your hand, but you might find that you've got to move it a little bit just to accommodate the fleshiness and to sort of note the measurement of the closed fist. Now for me, I know that my right hand is my larger hand. My open hand measurement was 21.6 centimeters and my closed fist was 22.2. The next thing I want to do is to be drawing out a sort of, I've drawn an axis on just to help me kind of start to measure the hand. My measurement from the page is 10 centimeters from the left hand side, about 15 centimeters up from the base. Obviously if you're left-handed your axis might be round the other way. Now if I was just to sort of create a pattern from looking at these measurements, and I'll sort of talk you through the measurements I'm going to take, I can see that just measuring across the flat hand I've got 8.6 centimeters, and if I was to double that, that's still not going to give me quite enough to actually get round my hand. So what I've got to do is then work out, using some key measurements, how we're going to do that. So when we're adding our allowances, we want to come up with a pattern where the fingers look balanced. You don't want, and I've exaggerated a couple of examples here, you don't want to be adding on the difference and sort of creating a glove pattern where the fingers look significantly out of balance, and I've kind of exaggerated this a little bit to sort of show it on camera a little bit more. Neither do you want to be adding all of your allowances to your index and your fifth finger, so we have to kind of work out the best way of approaching adding our allowances so that we actually get a glove that reflects the sort of the dimensions of the hand. So one of the first things I'm going to do is to measure around the first knuckle on your hand because that's wider than the second, and that just gives me a sort of an overall circumference for each knuckle, and I've noted those measurements down. So I've measured each first knuckle. I have also measured the thumb. That's useful a bit later on, but it is useful just as a good bit of practice. I've also then measured, and that's just going with a ruler, I'm going across the page, just the flat measurement, to work out the flat measurement of my fingers. And I've noted each of those down. I have put some measurements underneath that I'm going to come on to. So just starting to look at my pattern, I know that I've got to have a measurement sort of for my closed fist, which is 22.2 centimeters. So the glove has to kind of go around the hand, and as I look at my flat pattern I've sort of halved that measurement because I'm not going to be drawing 22 centimeters out here and then doing it for the back, because otherwise it would create a bit of a monster pattern. So I know as a sort of little guide I've marked that half of 22.2 is 11.1, so I've marked my 11.1 there. That is just a guide at this point. I'm not putting in a definite line, and you'll see why in just a moment. So I've got to sort of work out that it's a bit like I'm taking a sort of a slice through my hand, so that when I work out the allowances, in fact I'm going to halve them, so that by the time they're opened out and in the gloving pattern, I've got the full kind of at 22.2 covered within my pattern on my hand. For the purposes of drafting our pattern, imagine, if you will, I've taken a kind of a slice through my hand, so I'm just working with that 1/2. I've drawn a line on it. I wouldn't recommend doing this. I've drawn it on with the Sharpie to try and sort of illustrate how I've worked out adding the allowances, and this is sort of what I'm going to be working with. So I'm going to be adding that sort of depth in, because that's going to be quite important to our measurements, but obviously I've got to sort of add it on in a way that balances out the width of my fingers across the rest of the glove. So we're going to be sort of, when we talk about the measurements and why I'm halving them, because we're working with the front and back of the hand. So what I basically do to get my 11.1 centimeters across the hand, by doing that, I'm then also getting the other side of the hand to create my 22.2 across the widest part of the hand. And I always find it helpful to start working out my allowances with the index finger, and I can look at my finger and I could measure it. I can eyeball it if I wish. I'm not that good with my measurements. I can certainly measure it, or I can kind of start to look at it against the measurements that I've got on the paper here. And I've found that looking at sort of the measurements and measuring using that first knuckle measurement to help me then sort of work out the difference is going to be the best way of making the glove, and that certainly worked for me. So yes, you can do it by eye. Yes, you can measure the side and then add on the allowance accordingly. But I've found the third way, which I'm going to go into an explanation about, a lot more helpful. So I know that the measurement around my knuckle is 7 centimeters, and I've already got the flat measurement across my finger. Now I know that that flat measurement I've got there covers the back of the hand, but it also covers the front of the hand as well, sort of with my palm view. So if I add 2.2 for the back of the hand, 2.2 for the palm of the hand, I get 4.4 centimeters. Now if I subtract 4.4 from 7 centimeters, which is giving me that measurement there, I know that I get 2.6. Now clearly I'm not going to be adding 2.6 centimeters onto my glove, because that's going to create a monster, particularly if you think, well, the index finger would then be coming all the way out over here, and we don't want that. So I'm going to halve that measurement again, which then gives me the bit for the front and the bit for the back. So if I divide that by 2, I get 0.65, and that then I'm going to round up to 0.7, because I know it's my index finger and I've made previous mock-ups and know that it'll work out. So I'm going to make a mark that's 0.7, so 7 millimeters or 0.7 of a centimeter away from that line, and that I'm now going to join up with the other marks I've made, and that's going to become my new center line. So that's going to be factoring in the depth of my index finger. And the green line that I've now drawn is my new center line. So if you like, I'm sort of looking at, I've looked at that measurement of 7 centimeters. I have looked at sort of measuring the depth of my finger, but I've also sort of thought, well, actually the glove is going to be a little bit wider in the finger in order to get round, so perhaps measuring and working from that sort of pure depth might not give me the glove that I want. So we've sort of broken it down, measured it sort of numerically. So now my index finger has that extra addition of that 0.7 on this side, but as you can see on here, if I then open out my pattern piece, I've actually given myself a depth of kind of 1.4 centimeters, and that's going to be starting the fold to go around our fingers. So that's the first allowance that we've added on, and that then takes my, so if I add the 0.7 to just the flat measurement across my hand, that gives me 2.9. So that distance is now 2.9, and I'm going to draw another vertical line here, because then I'm going to work my way across the rest of the hand. So I've drawn in the line, which is the line for my index finger, and that finger will then just have that allowance kind of added on, and we'll shape that later on. I do find it quite helpful next to then work out the depth of the the fifth finger, because that then gives me what I can then add on to those two fingers, if you like. So again, I can do it by eye, I can measure the side of the finger, or I can work from the knuckle measurement. And I find it really helpful to work from that knuckle measurement, because we're sort of going from a flat paper to something a little bit more three-dimensional. So what I would do is add 1.9 for the back of the hand, 1.9 for the front of the hand, subtract that from the knuckle measurement, and that gives me a measurement of 1.9 centimeters. Now I know that I'm not just going to add 1.9 out to the side here, because that would in effect give me, if I added the front and back together, I'd end up by doubling it. So what I need to do is divide that 1.9 by 2, and that gives me a measurement of 0.95, which I'm then adding on to my 1.9, and that gives me a measurement of 2.85. So I know that this finger, when I get to it, is going to be 2.5 or 2.85, beg your pardon, centimeters across. You can of course round that measurement up if you wish, but I know that my fifth finger isn't as wide as my index finger, so I know that I don't perhaps need to sort of be as generous there. So we've now worked out the allowance for our index finger, and we know when we get to it the allowance we're going to be adding on for our fifth finger. So you can, to measure the third and the fourth finger if you wish, measure around the knuckle and then sort of work out what we're going to do. I've tried to sort of simplify it because I'm not a maths genius, and I tend to find it a little bit easier to sort of work out with the differences. Another way of looking at this is to take the flat hand measurements, to double it, and then to subtract that from the overall closed fist measurement. So if I'm looking at that particular example, I know that if I do 8.6 for the back of the hand, for the front of the hand, that comes to 17.2. If I then subtract 17.2 from my closed fist measurement, which is 22.2 centimeters, I then get a difference of 5 centimeters that I've got to add into my pattern. Now I know, rather conveniently, if I then divide 5 centimeters in half to get the front and the back, it actually comes down to 2.5 centimeters that I'm adding per side. So it's good to have sort of a couple of ways in which to check things and cross-reference, because you might find that there's a millimetre or two difference, but actually we know we're heading in the right direction. Now the easiest way I found to work out the measurement for the third finger and the fourth finger is to subtract the new measurements for the index and the fifth finger away from our overall sort of width that we're going to be gaining on this side. So I know that I need a minimum of 11.1 centimeters. If I then add my 2.9 and my 2.85 together, I get a grand total of 5.75 centimeters. Now if I subtract 5.75 centimeters from 11.1, I'm left with 5.35. I can then add together my current flat width of 2.2 for the third and 1.9 for the fourth finger, and I get a grand total of 4.1 centimeters. Now, in order to then sort of work out how much I'm going to add, I need to subtract 4.1 from the result of the crosshand measurement, which comes to 5.35 minus 4.1, which gives me a centimetre, or 1.25 centimetres. Now I divide that by 2 because I know that I've got my 2 fingers to the fit on there, and that means that I'm adding a 0.6 centimetres to the third and 0.6 centimetres to the fourth fingers. Now as I'm looking at these, I'm sort of thinking, okay, so 2.9, 2.8, 2.85 are sort of fairly similar. I might just sort of take a little bit of artistic license with my fourth finger to help sort of balance it out, and just add on sort of 0.3 of a millimeters to take it up to 2.8, because I don't want to sort of have sort of skinny kind of one finger wide on the others. I want the glove to look quite sort of balanced. So what I'm going to do with my fourth finger is take up a little bit of artistic license, add on 0.3, which will give me 2.8 centimeters for my index, for my fourth finger. And that will give me a slightly better balance across the pattern. So the next thing for me to do now is to draw my next lot of vertical lines reflecting these new measurements. So all I'm now doing is shifting, in effect, what's going to be the lines that divide the fingers over a little bit more to accommodate the new width. So for the first line I've already done the index finger, I'm doing the middle finger at the moment. I've measured a line that's parallel to my index finger and that line there, and I've measured it 2.8 centimeters away. I'm now going to measure the line for my fourth finger, and again that is 2.8 centimeters away, and then after I've done that I'll measure 2.85 for the fifth finger, so that last point will then get covered. So you can see now I've added my new vertical lines, which are going to be the sort of the rest of that glove panel. I've added a couple of little red marks here just to show where I've moved the base of the fingers over, because that's quite important in the next stage of drafting our pattern. Now, just in case you're starting to worry about your measurements or something doesn't look quite right, one of the things that we've got to do before we start to sort of panic that we've suddenly got more, we're not quite wide enough, is remember that we've moved our sort of center line and our fold over a little bit. So in order to sort of just check that, of course I need to then measure my 11.1 from this new line. So if I actually measure 11.1 out, I can see that I'm actually just inside my line, which is a good thing. And we know that we've then got enough width out here. I do find that adding a taper does help with getting the glove on and off. It kind of gives you a little bit more flexibility to be able to get the hand into the glove in the first place. But when you start to sort of work out your measurements, just remember that you have moved that sort of center line over, and then we need to adjust the measurement on the other side as well. Otherwise you're going to be thinking you're going to get too big and perhaps too wide across the glove. So we've now finished adding our allowances onto our trank, and if you have a straight-sided one it can be quite tight to get the hand into, and if you've watched any of my other gloving videos you'll know that actually on one of the videos I did do straight sides whilst I was explaining the construction, and the glove ripped, which is just soul destroying. So I find that adding a slight angle and a taper does really help with the actual construction and the wear of the glove as well. So in order to do that, and certainly for the style of glove that I've got here, I know that sort of from my wrist bone, which is here, which I've sort of drawn on, and down, I've measured down 5 centimeters. Now I can see that this is the new line for my fifth finger, and what I find quite helpful is I tend to sort of measure out somewhere between 1.5 centimeters and 2 centimeters. So I'll make a little mark that's, say, 1.5 centimeters away from that final line for the fifth finger. Might make it slightly less. This is where you have to sort of use your judgment and make a mock-up. And what I will then do is sort of taper, probably from somewhere level with the mark that I've got in between my fourth and fifth fingers, roughly that. I will just taper the glove out. What I've also done is just added the differences on to my little wraparound grid that I was showing you earlier. Now this will be the one that goes matching up with the mark on my finger, so I've got that sort of center crease. I've then got my 0.7 either side of that, as you can see, and then I've added in the allowances for my fingers. So I know that by the time I've added in my fourchettes, I've kind of already got the depth. I've added the side taper, and that's helped me make sure that I've got enough coming across the glove. Thank you very much for watching and for joining me on this tutorial. I hope you found it useful, and I hope that by sort of doing this sort of different bits of division, it's helped kind of perhaps answer some of the questions about why we add different bits to the trank.